Very grateful, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the reported announcement that issues with the gearbox of the MV Caledonian Isles have been identified, resulting in a further delay to its return to service on the Arran route.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
My response as Transport Secretary is deep frustration and concern that the people and communities of Arran are facing a further day and a half with one ferry operating to Brodick rather than two, in addition to the Lochranza service. I have spoken to CalMac this morning and relayed my serious concern about this latest mechanical issue on the Caledonian Isles, which I have been told is gearbox failure, identified during berthing trials as it returned from a 9-month overhaul. The MV Isle of Arran must go for its annual overhaul on Wednesday, and that cannot be delayed. Its last sailing was due today at 1:55 p.m. Sailings to Arran on Wednesday will be from Troon on the MV Alfred. CalMac will advise later today of how they intend to provide resilience cover from then. I have impressed on them the Government's requirement that Arran, the busiest route on the network, is supported this week from Thursday and for the September weekend.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? The Minister must be getting a real sense of déjà vu. I've lost count of how many times I've stood on this front bench and heard words like regret and sorry and frustration and concern and apologies over endless breakdowns and cancellations on this route. This is a 1,000-passenger, 3-decade-old vessel. It's no wonder it's breaking down. It's been out of action since February of this year. It's utterly unbelievable. Of course, it was due back in service to take over from its replacement, the Isle of Arran, which is now off for its annual service. But what that means is today there are no vessels, no services running out of Ardrossan to Isle of Arran. You cannot book on the Alfred tomorrow. We tried to do it just 5 minutes ago. That service is now full, understandably, because of its reduced capacity. And of course, that limited capacity is what's really affecting our island economies. None of this is good enough, Cabinet Secretary. And the Cabinet Secretary mentioned the Government's frustration. What about the islanders' frustration in all of this? This is a problem that's been in the making for nearly a decade now. Can I ask simply, how on earth are CalMac going to magic a new vessel out of thin air to cover the Ardrossan to Arran route, and which other island will have to suffer as a consequence of that decision?
Cabinet Secretary.
So in my remarks, I did specifically share my concern with the people of Arran and the people and communities there. Part of the reason that I'm sure that the member is aware of these issues is that there has been engagement directly by CalMac since Sunday evening with all the relevant different stakeholders. Our Isle of Arran Ferry Committee has already replied in terms of their preference as to what can happen as part of that resilience and prioritisation that now takes place in terms of ensuring that that capacity is there. He's right to identify the capacity. That's why they're moving swiftly to ensure there is capacity, especially for this busy weekend. Obviously, that's not just the only community that will be affected, and that's why that engagement is ongoing, and there will be an announcement later on this evening, as I set out.
Jamie Green.
I mean, I really feel sorry for CalMac in all this, actually, because what they're doing is playing one big constant juggling act of vessels. Vessels that are old and are breaking down. They're pulling vessels from other routes. Other islands are suffering. And the whole thing is just one endless movement of vessels from one route to another, routes which they should not be on in the first place. Of course, it's not just the vessels which are breaking down. The whole port infrastructure is crumbling as well. Because even when the Glen Sannox does enter service on the Arran route, and I hope it's soon, it will operate out of Troon instead of Ardrossan. For how long is anyone's guess? Is it weeks? Is it months? Is it years? Is it forever? And that's the problem. The people of Ardrossan simply don't know the answer to that question, because this government decided to build a ferry which is not fit for purpose for the port from which it is intended to operate. Unbelievable. Of course, one issue that I do want to raise, Presiding Officer, is the effect this is having on the economy of Ardrossan. And that's an issue we don't talk enough about, because tens of thousands of passengers are now trafficking through Troon and not Ardrossan. That's having a substantial effect on local businesses and the local economy. What does the Minister have to say to those local businesses across North Ayrshire who are actually the byproduct of such catastrophic handling of this government?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think the focus on business is important. You'll be aware, particularly for the Isle of Arran, there was measures taken as part of this budget to improve the situation, for example, on business rates for hospitality businesses in particular, but that was on the island. He's talking about the issues on the mainland in terms of the port support. Part of that economic impact is part of the work that's going on with North Ayrshire Council to help finalise the business development plan. The frustration with the business development plan, there are still outstanding key aspects of legal and commercial negotiations that need to be resolved. And I would urge all partners to work with my officials at Transport Scotland to find an expedient and beneficial conclusion to allow that business case to be finalised, because what that can do is help provide that greater certainty. And I think the issue that people are looking for, especially businesses, because they want to plan ahead, etc., is to provide that certainty. So I appreciate the points the member is making.
Brief supplementary, Katie Clark.
In the past 24 hours, a number of constituents have been in touch with me concerned they won't make hospital appointments. A farmer who won't be able to get their lambs off the island to market tomorrow and so will have to wait another month, and a visitor whose family of 6 in 2 cars, including a disabled person, are stranded on the island. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree the ferry crisis is becoming a national emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
So in terms of the resilience, I reference that there is an issue tomorrow, and she's relayed the impact and the very personal impact that has on a number of people. The Kranza service will be available to some, but not all, not least, I think, the examples that she's giving. And that's why we need far more certainty and resilience. That's why it's important to recognise we're expecting the Glen Sannox to enter into service in the next few months, in terms of the delivery in the next few weeks, and then obviously the familiarisation. That will allow that resilience aspect there. So we have this period, which is a challenge. I recognise that. It's frustrating for individuals. It's also, I think, as we've heard, frustrating for CalMac as well, because they're having to obviously deal with that reorganisation, and customers and passengers who have very serious needs indeed. So I recognise the situation. If there's anybody with a hospital appointment, obviously, there's an issue to contact CalMac. There may be, in terms of bookings with the MV Alfred, capacity issues, but part of the new changes is to ensure that there's reservations to allow people for emergency situations to be able to use. I can't guarantee that, but I would encourage her to let her constituents know that.
Brief supplementary, Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Mr Pettigrew, who is currently the CEO of Ferguson Marine, seems to be suffering from more and more delays. David Timon was sacked after 2. Mr Pettigrew's had at least 3. But turning to the issue of this ferry, what bunkering arrangements have been made to handle the LNG fuel that is required for the new ferry at Troon? Because we've had 10 years to get it ready. I'd like to know what's actually been done, Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
So the original question was about a gearbox on another vessel, but on the basis that the member wants to ask about the Glen Sannox, and I've just mentioned the Glen Sannox. Obviously, in terms of the bunkering is as planned, and it will be delivered by vehicle, which was always the intention until such times as the Ardrossan port was built, and therefore there would be more permanent bunkering as far as that's concerned. And obviously part of the current delays that we've seen in the last few weeks in terms of the Glen Sannox with successful sea trials was the original issue around the temperature and the LNG. That has now been resolved, and there's been successful sea trials commencing. There'll be some further, as I've just identified in my answer, but I hope that gives him an understanding that the position has not changed.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Recent press reports suggest that the MV Isle of Lewis and the MV Isle of Mull will be sold from the fleet when the new ferries join. For over a decade, I've been asking the Scottish Government to keep capacity in the fleet to provide cover for dry docking for times of high demand and to avoid the very circumstances we're talking about today. Will she reconsider the sale of these ships and ensure that there are 2 ships in the fleet at any one time to cover breakdowns so that communities are not left high and dry in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not going to speculate on media reports. What I can say is she makes the point about ensuring that there is resilience in the fleet once the new vessels come in. And of course, it's not just the Glen Sannox, it's Glen Rosa and 4 other vessels. So by 2026, there'll be 6 new major vessels in the fleet. But the important point is about how we sensibly use that resilience, how the cascading of vessels is used, and that was an issue that I discussed at the Islands Transport Forum just last week with leaders from our islands, because again, not just with the 6 that are coming on stream, but the 7 after that in terms of the small vessel replacement, they're not just for the routes that the new vessels will go on. There'll be a cascade impact which we hope will provide that greater resilience that she and I'm sure others want to see.